Hello, everybody. Very warm welcome to today's webinar on using B2C strategies to build a B2B pipeline. So my name's John Paget. I'm Senior Partner at Open Velocity. And I'm joined by Bethan Vincent, Managing Partner and my colleague at Open Velocity, and also Kiri Craig, Managing Partner of onebite, a demand gen B2B agency. So if you've not joined us before, the format's pretty simple. We've got a handful of questions. There are 3 of us, and we have 30 minutes to get through what is this month an incredibly big topic. Now, in terms of the title, we're not going to try to chew our way through the whole gamut of possible talking points because we'd be here all week. What we are going to do is have a fairly broad opening question, and then we'll narrow down onto the topics of thought leadership and social media. Now, if you've got any questions through the next half an hour, please do pop them in the chat. We can't promise to get to them on the webinar today. Our track record for that isn't great, but we will endeavour to get responses up onto the Open Velocity website next week, along with a recording of this webinar. Okay, so in terms of today's topic, we usually bring the topics of our webinar from client challenges that we are seeing or hearing or experiencing. But this month, it's a little bit different, and we are exploring an emerging trend that's happening in B2B and B2C. Now, there's a couple of bits of research that I want to cite just as a bit of context. So both Gartner and Forrester have published work already this year that are alluding to the way that our workforce is changing. And like never before, the workforce of today, and certainly of tomorrow, is digitally native and digitally enabled. We've got 50% of the UK workforce are now millennials, and 20% are Gen Z. And so what this is leading to is a situation where people want information, they want all of the options, they want pricing, and they quite often want to validate an idea, that is to test it in the here and the now. And that's really challenging the way that traditional B2B has often worked. So, Bethan, let me come to you first. What are your thoughts on this, with B2B looking more and more like B2C?
I think there are a couple of things happening here. So you've cited one, it's the changing nature of the workforce and the kind of content, I guess, requirements of that as well. And also, I think B2B has been really boring for a long time and really stale, and the same old playbooks, the same old content formats, the same old type of information. And that works okay in a market where there's more demand and supply, right? You can kind of get away with that, but obviously we're going into a recessionary period, a period of kind of, rough economic outlook. And I think a lot of B2B companies are finding that actually the stuff that they were trying yesterday no longer works as well today. And actually this is where looking at B2B and that concept of building a brand, building affinity with an audience, and being kind of a standout choice for your target market as well is really coming in. And that's something we know B2C does really well, especially in FMCG. So I think that's why eyeballs are turning. It's expectations driven by the market, but also B2B brands as well are kind of thinking we need to do something different here.
Yeah, and Kiri, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree with Bethan. I think there is a real opportunity in B2B to carve out a niche and be differentiated. And I think it's more important than ever. And I think there's so much opportunity to learn from the B2C sector in that. And I think one of the things that I was just thinking back to the earlier part of my career, and I worked in B2C, that I think B2C does really well is understanding its customer. And I think B2B is quite far behind in this sometimes. And actually, arguably, I think it's harder in B2B because the customer base is slightly narrower, and you really do need to understand that customer in order to get that cut through. So the B2C world is really good at this. They do a lot of research. They really go out and try to get under the skin of their customer and their needs. And I think the B2B world could really do with a bit more catching up on that. There is a lot of it around, but there's still work to be done in terms of understanding customers, how to talk to them, where they are, positioning yourself as kind of a go-to expert in what they need.
Yeah, I could see Bethan nodding away seriously, and I was totally agreeing with you there. And I think you're right. It's definitely harder, isn't it, for B2B? Something that we come up against a lot when we're working with clients. Okay, I mean, you've also touched on thought leadership there, and that's sort of where we're going now with the rest of the questions. So, Kiri, let me come back to you then first with what do we mean by thought leadership? And are there any B2B examples that you really feel stand out that would be good to point out now?
Yeah, I mean, in my view, thought leadership is the positioning of either a company or an individual as a go-to expert on a particular subject matter. So using their perhaps industry perspective or their industry expertise and insight to position either a company or a person as a thought leader and as an expert. And actually, that's something that's I think is quite interesting, that it can be one or the other. And actually, the two things together is very powerful. So if a brand can be a thought leader, then that's one thing. But if a figurehead within that business is willing to be the face of that and a bit more human, and bring, some of those messages to life, it's really important that everybody's singing from the same strategy, though. So you can't have one person going off saying this and the business is saying that. I think you've got to be really aligned on that strategy. But for me, thought leadership is really becoming a go-to expert on a particular subject. And in terms of examples, there are so many out there that do this really well, actually, both from a company and an individual perspective. I think, companies like HubSpot are brilliant at this. I think Deloitte does this very well, actually, as well. And they have, so many different types of thought leadership. And again, this is another interesting point. I think sometimes in B2B, people worry that thought leadership is a 2,500 word white paper or report. Yes, that's an important part of it. That builds credibility, but thought leadership is so much broader than that. It's inserting yourself into the conversation. It's having a viewpoint. It's speaking at an event. It's commenting on a post on social media in the right place with the right viewpoint. So I think, there's so much more to it than writing a 2,500 words white paper. But yeah, Deloitte for me do it really well. And I think they have this great thing called the Press Room podcasts. I don't know if either of you have seen them, but just the way that they do them, their podcasts, they're kind of standard in that format, but they're always very hard hitting. They get some great guests onto it. And what I particularly like is they transcribe everything afterwards. So it's very accessible in terms of content. So you can either read it, you can listen to it. But from an SEO perspective, it's absolutely brilliant to have that whole thing transcribed. So from a keyword point of view, you're driving people to that content.
Yeah. And Bethan, let me come to you and maybe also put you on the spot and think about the SEO point that Kiri's just mentioned, because I'm sure you'll have a view on that as well.
Yeah, I think it ties back to, as well, in B2B, it's this idea we've got to do these massive pieces of content and they've got to stand alone. And it's actually looking at the kind of repurposing of them. So how do we break it down into different formats? And, this is a cheeky plug, but hint, hint, we do this with these webinars. This webinar is an example of hopefully reasonably good thought leadership. We'll send it to you afterwards. We'll break it down into a blog post. So, the distribution element of it is just as important as the production of it. And I think that's where there's often a gap. Lots of companies produce quite interesting material. They just don't get it in front of the target audience. So I think you've really got to think about actually how are we going to get this in front of people? And actually, there's multiple channels. SEO is definitely a channel for doing that. And I think actually, in terms of this is the thing I keep on banging on about, Google's EEAT update. So this expertise, experience, authority, and trust they're looking for in content. Thought leadership is the prime opportunity for demonstrating that. And then also, to throw in on my final point, another kind of buzzwordy trend, AI, right? And what's the one thing that AI can't do? It can't have a personal opinion. It can't have an experienced view on the subject matter. So I think thought leadership is almost this kind of antidote to the mass-produced generative AI content, synthetic content we're going to see kind of hit the web. So smart brands are thinking about this, definitely. How do we stand out in this, when the cost of content production falls to nil, which it has, how do we stand out and how do we be experienced and experts in our area?
Yeah, and I think if Lisa, our other colleague, was here, I can hear her say that in the future, with the rise of AI-generated content, actually thought leadership will become increasingly more important as people need to search through ever bigger amounts of content to really seek out stuff that's really valuable. So, yeah. Okay. Let's have a look at question 2 then. So, Bethan, let me come to you. How should B2B businesses evaluate whether social media and thought leadership should be part of their marketing mix?
With nuance. So, we often get clients come and say, oh, look, we think we should be on every social media platform. We want to be on Instagram. We want to be on Twitter. We want to be on Facebook. We want to be on LinkedIn. And that's just because those channels exist. They think they should be on them. And actually, there's a step back and actually, where does my audience live? And where does my audience want to consume content and the type of content I want to produce? So I'd say if you're a hard-hitting, B2B manufacturer, unless you've got something very visually interesting, Instagram might not be the right one for you. So it's a bit of a less is more approach. If you're not executing on thought leadership already, or on social media already, I think start out with one channel and build that channel up and kind of test and learn and iterate from that. But literally go and ask your customers, where do you consume content? Where do you find out answers to the questions you've got about the type of work we do? That'll give you some really good pointers. But don't just blindly spread yourself over every surface area, because the cost of content production to service that is going to be huge. And also you're going to have a lot of wasted effort in there.
Yeah. And I might just add in there that it's the skills and the capabilities of doing this repeatably, right? And over the long term, because it's all well and good doing it as a one-time thing, but actually that's not going to generate the long-term impact and the results that you're going to want. So Kiri, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think you're right. Thought leadership, social media, they're great opportunities, particularly in B2B, to build brand awareness and demonstrate your credibility over a long period of time. So there's all these stats bandied around about how many people are in market to buy right now. 5% of the market's actually in a buying cycle, 95% out. Whatever that exact stat is, the point is that people aren't always in a buying cycle, and B2B buying cycles are really long. So these sorts of tactics are great if you know where your audience is. And Bethan's absolutely right. There's no point in plastering it over everything. You have to understand where your audience is. How do they consume content? And also actually take a step back and think, what is the gap in the market for us? Is there an opportunity there? Or are we just adding to the noise with the same message? Because if you're not standing out and you don't have a differentiated viewpoint, again, you're just adding to the noise. You're not actually really becoming a thought leader. So I would advise exactly what Bethan and you have both already said. Think about where the audience is, but really think about that opportunity and where the gap is in the market and how you can insert yourself into that.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to tackle that specifically on a future question, because there's clearly a big challenge with so much already being done, isn't there? And finding that niche. But before we get there, let me ask you both about the lessons that we can learn from the B2B leaders who maybe are currently doing this well. Kiri, let me come to you on that one.
Yeah, so I think for me, there's three parts to this, I think. So there's one is having an opinion and staying true to that. So having a strategy of some kind, however loose that strategy is, you need to have something to hang your hat on. You need to have an opinion. John, you alluded to this before about consistency and ensuring, it's not a one-hit wonder. You can't just, I don't know, even if you write that amazing 2,500 word white paper, you can't just do that once. And I mean, you can cut that up into lots of different things, but you need to be there consistently and consistently banging that drum with the same message. And we've already talked about this, but visibility is my third point. It's getting in front of your audience in the right place consistently. So making sure that they can see you, and that distribution channel is really well thought through. So create the content, work out how you're going to distribute it to the right audience.
And Bethan, your thoughts on this?
Well, I think there's also an angle around employee advocacy that's often missed. So a lot of B2B brands might have their CEO or their kind of senior management team doing thought leadership and kind of posting from, and also you've got to remember on platforms like LinkedIn, personal posts from personal profiles perform better than company pages as well. So optimizing for the algorithm of the platform you're executing on is really important. But it's not just about the thoughts of the kind of senior team. Actually, all your employees can act as ambassadors for your business. Now, there are pros and cons to this, right? Because not all employees want to be, and that's absolutely fine. So you've got to find a way to incentivize that. And, I've worked with organizations where we kind of have prizes for the best post, or, we have some kind of incentive mechanism there, and that can work well, but also not letting your employees kind of go off the rails and maybe post things that are against your positioning or your kind of company values. And that's where having really kind of clear, I guess, a strategy for it, messaging, people kind of understand why they're doing it, what they're trying to get out there is really important as well. And there's a couple of brands that do this really well. So Rise at 7, they're a PR agency, a search first creative PR agency. I think they do it really, really well and historically have done it well. Actually, we've got a podcast episode with Stephen Kenwright on that very subject that might be worth diving into. And also there's a company called Refine Labs as well, who are US based marketeers, and you'll see the posts come from their CEO, they come from their, every employee is getting involved and they're talking to each other, and that's quite an interesting approach, kind of almost having a conversation in public as well. So don't just think it has to be your CEO posting, it can be everyone, and that can be incredibly valuable.
Yeah, and I'd maybe add persistence into that as well. I think both of you meant, it's about consistency and it's about visibility. It's also about persistence, and I would give a shout out to Penelope Bellegarde, who we had on the webinar in a recent month, and also to Tua Wright. And they are both leaders and founders of small businesses, and they use LinkedIn increasingly almost as like a CRM. But they are constantly visible, to your point, Kiri, but they are persistent, and they are making sure that the ways in which they interact, whether it's through groups, other threads, their own content, isn't always lengthy, as you said, 2,000 word white papers or reports to demonstrate thought leadership. It's being really consistent with their messages and the areas of expertise that they have. And then also tapping into the new opportunities. So, when Guild came along as a sort of a rival, the people that have now made that a success were some of the first people to move over there, because they spotted that opportunity, they were persistent with it, and now they've got some really well-established groups and communities there. So that is all playing into that idea of this, only 5% of people in a market might actually be in market at that time. And you are as much, if not more so, planning for the 2, 3, 4, 5 months down the track when that majority of the market will then start to become in market. So that's a pivotal part, I think, is it's persistence to add to that list.
Can I just add one more? Sorry, can I be really cheeky and dive in? And I think it is about having something, and this may be to your next question, John, but having something worth saying. And we've all seen those LinkedIn posts that are, look at me, aren't I great, aren't I wonderful, I'm on holiday in my yacht, or whatever they're doing. Great for them, but what value is that adding to the audience, apart from maybe some FOMO? But doing it wrong can be just as damaging, or if not more damaging than not doing it at all. And that's maybe something to think about.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. We hadn't got that on our list of questions because we've only got time for a handful, but we could definitely have a whole debate, couldn't we, about the benefits of actually taking time to not do anything versus doing something badly in the first place, right? So yeah, okay, let's move on, because I alluded to this question before, and it's how do businesses compete in an age of content overload? And I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this. So Bethan, let me come to you first.
I think it goes back to maybe the point I was making previously about having something important and interesting to say, and something substantive and new to say as well. And I think, to be perfectly honest, if ChatGPT could write the article or the LinkedIn post you've written, then you're kind of missing the point. You're just adding more to the noise. So, what I try and do, and I do try and do thought leadership on LinkedIn. I try and kind of reflect on maybe some client challenges I've seen. And actually, is there a lesson in there that other businesses can learn from? Because that's a unique point of view that I've seen into a specific challenge there. So, I would say relate it back to your personal experience, and that goes back to EEAT, right? Your experience of the subject matter. And I think also different formats as well. So don't think it has to be text, it can be video. You can do multiple different formats as well, video, image, and that just helps you cut through on the feed, because you can have the best written content, but people have got that nanosecond kind of almost interest, or they're not going to consume reams of content if you don't hook them in the first second. So really think about that hook as well. So that's quite a few different points in there, but I think they're all quite important.
Yeah, and Kiri, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think, creating that standout is so important. And the only thing I'd really add to that is whether you can, in terms of adding credibility to some of what you're saying. So Bethan's absolutely right that understanding the audience and what their challenges are, but can you add any data to back that up? If it's your own owned data, even better. So if you run a survey and you've got own data that you can then utilize and create multiple assets out of, that is a really powerful asset that you can use. You can really sweat that and use that for a long time. So just thinking about that credibility point of view, and those data points actually help you with that, the hook that Bethan just talked about. So actually creating that real attention grabbing headline, because if you've got that data to back it up, you can do something, you can just push it that little bit further and be confident in your viewpoint on that. And then the other thing I would say is just around messaging and moving from the what to the why. So always thinking about that benefit if you can. It depends on what you're talking about, particularly if you're going to talk about products or anything like that. Don't talk about features, always talk about benefits and the why and what does this mean for you. And that goes for all marketing. That's not just thought leadership or social media, that's everything. But just always thinking about that why, I think, really helps frame things in your mind when you're planning these things out.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You mentioned that sort of proprietary data and something, that insight that only you can have access to, and that is so valuable if you can get that. And that should very much be a part of a strategic conversation. It's not possible for all businesses, but if it's possible, it's a real opportunity. If you can, it takes time, obviously, but if you can get there, it then, as you said, gives you real authority and ability to drive some real impact and some reach.
Yeah.
I was going to mention here as well, there was some research published, some more research published, and there were a few stats that really jumped out that I thought were relevant here. So it was 50% of business leaders were spending a week or more, an hour a week or more consuming content. And that 70% said that less than half of what they consume gave them valuable insights. And then there were 47% felt thought leadership wasn't created with their specific needs in mind. And I think those three together really sort of, they combat perhaps this sense that there's no opportunity left and that there is already so much being done that it's impossible for any business to be able to start and to make an impact. And actually, I think that's what that's telling us, is that there is definitely a role and a future for thought leadership, and lots of people are searching for it. Lots of people are spending a significant amount of time consuming it, but they're not always getting something that they feel speaks directly to them. And I think that one of the big takeaways from this discussion that I'm getting, and I think we've all mentioned it, is start off small, start off really niche, and deliver something of real value to a really small audience. And then with that success, build up. And I think that's borne out by those three statistics.
Yeah, I'd also add, don't expect your junior especially if you work in an advanced industry, you work life sciences, tech, something very complex. Don't expect your junior marketing exec to be able to write compelling thought leadership without any input from subject matter experts. That's why we end up with a lot of bland stuff, because we're not giving the people, the writers, the content creators, the information, the insight they need to actually create something compelling and good. So, and this goes back to, you kind of get what you pay for. We've seen clients outsource content to very cheap content writers. I'm not saying some of them can't be good. Sometimes you can find someone amazing who's really greatly priced, but actually, these people kind of just churning out articles for the sake of it. They're not adding any value. It's why you get those kind of very SEO keyword stuff articles that you read, and like, this doesn't answer my question. This isn't anything interesting. Why did I waste my time on this? Again, doing it badly can be more damaging than not doing it at all.
Yeah, definitely. Kiri, did you have anything else you wanted to mention there, or should we move on?
I think we can move on. I think it's just about that, sweating that asset again, for me, is such an important thing. Get that asset and use it across as many things as you can. So, get that similar, consistent message across as many places as you can.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's a nice segue into our last question then, which is, how do businesses integrate thought leadership and social media with all the other marketing activities that they're currently doing? So, Kiri, what would your advice here be? I mean,
I think if you're going to look at adding any new marketing activity into your strategy, I think the first thing is always to take an honest look at your marketing strategy as it is at the moment. Is it working? What's working? Use data to try and help you pinpoint what is and what isn't working, because there's no point if everything is performing really well and you can't really see the opportunity for thought leadership, or, for example, why are you adding it into there? You're just going to spread yourself really thinly across all the other strategies and channel mix that are performing really well. So I think the first thing to do is to really review your current marketing activities and see what you can drop perhaps and bring this in. And I think, again, we've already talked about this. It's, you know, it is a big dedication of time and resource to consistently create high quality content. And as we've already said, you don't want to just be churning out rubbish. There's just absolutely no point. So how can you dedicate the time, the resource, the money to creating high quality content on a consistent basis? How can you repurpose it? How can you utilize it across channels? And test and learn. You know, Bethan's already sort of said this: start small, see how it goes, make it really, really niche, really tight, really audience focused, and grow from there. So I think don't try and do too much all in one go would be my top tip with this, because you could get completely overwhelmed and completely lost in what you're trying to do.
As a soundbite for this half-hour webinar, Kiri, I think that was pretty good. Bethan, what would you add here?
I think it's expect a long-term horizon on return from this type of activity. You're not going to post one LinkedIn post and get 10 leads off the back of it. And anyone promising you that, frankly, doesn't know what they're doing. And I'll stake my name on that. So this is a long-term activity, and also, it may not result in direct conversions off the back of it, but actually it can be really helpful in speeding up pipeline velocity. So I know for one of our clients, it's very interesting. They know when they speak to prospects, the prospects maybe won't have come in through, if they're posting on LinkedIn, the prospects come in through organic search. But actually, when they speak to the prospect as part of the buying cycle, the prospect will go, I saw that thing you wrote on LinkedIn the other day about this problem. We have that. Can you tell me a bit more about how you solved that? And it just really builds that trust, that relationship. You become that go-to source for information. So don't think you can just roughly measure it in conversions. Actually, there are other kind of efficiencies it can bring in across your full marketing funnel.
Yeah, and I guess I would add that don't try to bolt on thought leadership or social media to something that's already in place. I think you have to go back to the strategic drawing board and make sure that it's an integral part of the strategy, because otherwise it won't integrate and it won't do all the things that you and Kiri have just said, right? Which is being able to produce once and be able to then repurpose and reuse. I remember marketing conference like 15 years ago where Porsche were just talking about them doing this. So that concept is not new. Right, that the ability in the tech also to enable us to do that is not new, and yet I think still many businesses are struggling with it. So I think we can make sure that we're just focused on the basics. I would also give a shout out to Dave Chaffee, who's got a great content marketing matrix that is really useful, because I think in addition to having the ideas to help stand out, it's also the format. So there might be a lot of things that are happening in one particular space, but they're all following a similar format. So we've talked before about like Kantar and Deloitte. They all publish white papers and reports. And so, I think it's been done now, but at one point a podcast would have broken that mold, because the report and the white paper was all that was ever being done. And actually there's a nice way of being able to see if there's a different way of being able to get that message across through a variety of formats, and not just the sort of topics that are being, you might want to end up talking about. So we have about a minute left. Bethan, do you want to add anything before we wrap up?
I think we've roughly touched on this, but on the emerging channels points, because another question lots of marketeers are being asked at the moment in B2B in particular, should we be on TikTok? Interesting question. And I think TikTok in particular, and that video content format, that takes a lot of resource to do well. So if you're thinking about it, don't think it's a throwaway tactic. You can just bolt on, as you said, onto other things. It's got dedicated resource. It needs dedicated time to it. And again, that goes back to the question that, is your audience consuming content on there? Actually, there is some data that suggests older generations are increasingly going on to TikTok, and over 50s are using it, which is quite interesting. But just because the audience is on there doesn't necessarily mean they want to consume content about work on there. And I find it, I don't know if you guys get this, when I'm on Instagram, and I use Instagram for posting pretty pictures of traveling, it's nothing really to do with work, and I'll get an ad for a piece of software to do with what we do, and I'll be like, I don't want to see that, I'm relaxing. So just because I'm on there doesn't mean I want to consume your content on there. What mode am I in? What am I using that platform for? That's what you need to think about.
Yeah, good point on that, because I get bombarded, as I'm sure everybody does. Kiri, any final thoughts?
No, I think we've covered everything. I think for me, the key thing is just knowing your audience, know your target audience. And if you haven't done that yet, really spend the time thinking about them and understanding what they need from you, and then applying that to your opportunity and your gap, and developing your opinion and your standout points from that. So always start with audience for anything, to be honest, in B2B marketing, but particularly for this.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good piece of advice to wrap up on. So thank you, Kiri. Thank you, Bethan. Thank you to everybody that's jumped on the webinar today. Quick reminder that any questions that we've had put in the chat, we will get to and post up on the website next week. You can find all of our previous webinars there. And if you want to stay in touch with what we're doing or hear about future webinars, you can find us on LinkedIn. I think the next webinar we're going to be running will be on validating a product idea. And shortly after that, we're going to be having one dedicated to the Universal Analytics GA4 transition, which is coming around the corner. So we can't escape it for much longer. So yeah, find us on LinkedIn. You'll find details about those upcoming webinars, but that's it for now. We'll hope to see you soon. Thanks.